The Subjection of Women by John Stuart Mill quotes, "The Subjection of Women by John Stuart Mill, written in collaboration with Harriet Taylor Mill, is a profound critique of the legal and social inequalities faced by women in the 19th century. The book argues against the subordination of women, which Mill contends is unjust and a significant barrier to human progress. Mill highlights the need for equality between the sexes, particularly in marriage, education, and employment. His arguments are built upon rationality and justice, opposing deeply entrenched customs and prejudices that support male dominance. This book is considered groundbreaking for its time, as it passionately advocates for the empowerment of women, recognizing their equal capabilities and potential to contribute to society. It serves as both a philosophical inquiry and a powerful call for reform in the pursuit of gender equality." Quote 1. "The principle which regulates the existing social relations between the two sexes, the legal subordination of one sex to the other, is wrong in itself, and now one of the chief hindrances to human improvement. Mill argues that the current societal structure, which legally subordinates women to men, is fundamentally flawed. He sees this inequality as a significant barrier to overall human progress, stressing that such relations are neither natural nor just. Instead, Mill calls for the adoption of a principle based on equality, devoid of power or privilege on one side or disadvantage on the other, highlighting that true progress involves eliminating institutionalized discrimination." Quote 2. "The difficulty is that which exists in all cases in which there is a mass of feeling to be contended against." Mill explains that the real challenge in confronting societal inequality is not the lack of rational arguments, but rather the deep emotional attachment people have to traditional beliefs. People tend to defend long-held views even more strongly when presented with logical arguments against them, assuming that their emotional convictions must be justified by some deeper, unarticulated truth. This emotional entrenchment, Mill suggests, makes it difficult for society to abandon outdated customs, even in the face of reason. Quote 3. "In all other cases, the burden of proof is supposed to lie with the affirmative." Mill discusses how, in most debates, the burden of proof lies with those making a claim. However, when it comes to gender equality, the situation is reversed. Those advocating for the status quo expect the challengers to provide overwhelming evidence. Mill points out the unfairness of this expectation, as defenders of inequality are rarely asked to justify their stance, despite their views contradicting the principles of liberty and impartiality that should govern social relations. Quote 4. "It is one of the characteristic prejudices of the reaction of the 19th century against the 18th, to accord to the unreasoning elements in human nature the infallibility which the 18th century is supposed to have ascribed to the reasoning elements." Mill reflects on a shift in societal attitudes during the 19th century, where instinct and tradition are often held as sacrosanct, replacing the 18th century's emphasis on reason. He criticizes this shift as a regression, describing it as an idolatry of instinct, which is more degrading than overvaluing reason. Mill warns that such blind allegiance to unexamined feelings hinders societal progress, especially regarding equality between men and women. Quote 5. "The adoption of this system of inequality never was the result of deliberation or forethought or any social ideas or any notion whatever of what conduced to the benefit of humanity or the good order of society." Mill argues that the subjugation of women was never a conscious, reasoned decision aimed at improving society, but was instead a product of brute strength and coercion. This system evolved from physical dominance and then became enshrined in laws and customs without any genuine assessment of its fairness or benefits. Mill suggests that understanding this origin is crucial for dismantling such an institution, as it reveals its lack of moral or rational foundation. Quote 6. "People flatter themselves that the rule of mere force is ended, that the law of the strongest cannot be the reason of existence of anything which has remained in full operation down to the present time. Mill points out that many people falsely believe that society has completely moved beyond using force as the basis for power relationships. They think that institutions must still exist today because they serve a rational purpose and benefit everyone. However, Mill argues that the subordination of women is an example of an institution whose existence is not based on its value to society, but merely on the persistence of power held by those who initially obtained it through force. Quote 7. The truth is that people of the present and the last 2 or 3 generations have lost all practical sense of the primitive condition of humanity. Mill suggests that modern people have largely forgotten or failed to understand the brutal conditions of early human societies, where physical strength determined one's rights and status. This ignorance leads many to accept existing social structures without recognizing their origins in force and dominance. Mill emphasizes that understanding this primitive context is vital to realizing that the subjugation of women is an outdated remnant of an earlier, less civilized time. Quote 8. It could not make them renounce either of the applications of force militant, or force triumphant. The Church, despite its immense power over people's lives during the Middle Ages, could not persuade individuals to abandon their reliance on force, whether in the form of military aggression or domination over others. This underscores the deep-rooted nature of violence as a means of asserting power, which persisted even when other aspects of behavior could be controlled or altered. Mill uses this historical example to illustrate how challenging it is to bring about genuine moral change, especially when it involves curbing the use of power by those who have grown accustomed to wielding it. Quote 9. People are mostly so little aware how completely, during the greater part of the duration of our species, the law of force was the avowed rule of general conduct. Mill suggests that many people today are unaware of just how fundamental the law of force was to human society for most of its history. He emphasizes that customs and institutions that began purely through the exertion of brute strength have managed to survive well into modern times, despite evolving moral and ethical standards. The persistence of these institutions, like slavery, into the recent past serves as a powerful reminder that deeply rooted practices do not fade easily, especially when they benefit those in power. Quote 10. Such is the power of an established system, even when far from universal. Mill describes the immense strength of entrenched social systems, which endure not because they are inherently just or universally embraced, but because they have been normalized over time. He points out that unjust systems, such as absolute monarchy, survived for so long largely due to their integration into societal norms, even when most people suffered under them. The comparison to the power of men over women highlights how systemic inequality can persist for generations, especially when its roots are seen as natural, and its benefits are shared widely among those in power. Quote 11. Whatever gratification of pride there is in the possession of power, and whatever personal interest in its exercise, is in this case not confined to a limited class, but common to the whole male sex. Mill argues that the power men hold over women is unique compared to other forms of domination because it benefits every man, regardless of his social status. Unlike other power structures, which serve only the elite, male dominance is shared by all men, making it more deeply entrenched and resistant to change. This shared benefit means that the desire to maintain control is pervasive, reinforcing the system at every level of society, from the highest noble to the poorest laborer. Quote 12. No enslaved class ever asked for complete liberty at once. Mill points out that historically, oppressed groups have rarely demanded total freedom from the start. They typically begin by seeking relief from the most severe abuses. He uses this observation to explain why many women do not openly challenge their subordinate status, as they have been conditioned to view certain forms of oppression as inevitable. The reluctance of women to seek full emancipation, therefore, does not mean that they accept their situation willingly. Rather, it reflects the practical realities of resisting a power structure that exerts control over every aspect of their lives. Quote 13. Men do not want solely the obedience of women. They want their sentiments. Mill emphasizes that men desire not only the compliance of women, but also their genuine affection and emotional submission. Unlike other forms of subjugation that rely purely on fear, the domination of women involves manipulating their beliefs and emotions to ensure they willingly accept their subordinate role. This is achieved through education and societal expectations, which teach women from a young age that their purpose is to live for others and suppress their own ambitions. This emotional control makes the subjugation of women more complete and deeply embedded than other forms of power, as it extends beyond physical obedience to influence the very core of a woman's identity. Quote 14. The principal object of human pursuit, consideration, and all objects of social ambition can in general be sought or obtained by her only through him. Mill highlights how a woman's status and ambitions are primarily dependent on her relationship with a man, be it her husband or another significant male figure in her life. Women's societal roles and the rewards they seek are often tied to their ability to be attractive and agreeable to men, resulting in an education and character formation centered around subservience and pleasing men. This dependency perpetuates gender inequality, as women are conditioned to see their value only through the lens of male approval, rather than developing their own independent ambitions and identities. Quote 15. The course of history and the tendencies of progressive human society afford not only no presumption in favor of this system of inequality of rights, but a strong one against it. Mill argues that history shows a trend towards greater equality and freedom for all individuals, which stands in direct opposition to the continued subordination of women. He suggests that societal progress is characterized by breaking down barriers that bind people to fixed roles, and the present inequality between men and women is out of place in this trajectory of improvement. Therefore, it is only logical to conclude that this outdated relic of inequality must eventually vanish as society continues to evolve towards greater fairness and inclusion. Quote 16. Human beings are no longer born to their place in life and chained down by an inexorable bond to the place they are born to, but are free to employ their faculties and such favorable chances as offer to achieve the lot which may appear to them most desirable. Mill emphasizes that a defining feature of the modern world is the idea that individuals are no longer confined by the circumstances of their birth. People today are generally free to pursue their ambitions regardless of the social position they are born into. However, this principle of self-determination and the freedom to shape one's destiny has not yet been extended to women. Mill points out the inconsistency in allowing men to enjoy the benefits of freedom and personal ambition while continuing to restrict women to traditional roles, denying them the same opportunities. Quote 17. At present, in the more improved countries, the disabilities of women are the only case, save one, in which laws and institutions take persons at their birth, and ordain that they shall never in all their lives be allowed to compete for certain things. Mill points out the glaring inconsistency in modern legislation, where, aside from royalty, women are the only group whose opportunities are restricted simply due to the circumstances of their birth. He highlights that in almost all other areas of society, individuals are not legally barred from pursuing higher social positions or careers. However, women are subjected to lifelong limitations purely based on gender. Mill argues that this discrimination is an outdated vestige of an earlier age, completely at odds with the principles of equality and competition that underlie modern society. Quote 18. What is now called the nature of women is an eminently artificial thing, the result of forced repression in some directions, unnatural stimulation in others. Mill asserts that the traits commonly attributed to women's nature are not inherent, but are instead shaped by a long history of social conditioning that forces them into specific roles. Society has selectively nurtured certain qualities in women, such as submission and nurturing, while suppressing others like assertiveness and independence. Mill compares this process to the cultivation of a plant in a controlled environment, where some aspects are encouraged to grow, while others are deliberately stunted. This distorted development has led to a fundamentally flawed understanding of what women are capable of, as their true potential has never been allowed to flourish freely. Quote 19. Of all difficulties which impede the progress of thought and the formation of well-grounded opinions on life and social arrangements, the greatest is now the unspeakable ignorance and inattention of mankind in respect to the influences which form human character. Mill argues that one of the most significant obstacles to social progress is the widespread ignorance about how human character is shaped by external influences. People often fail to recognize that the traits they consider natural are largely the result of societal conditioning. This lack of understanding leads to the perpetuation of stereotypes and the acceptance of social inequalities, such as the subjugation of women. Mill insists that only by critically examining these influences can society move towards more just and rational social arrangements. Quote 20. Because women, as is often said, care nothing about politics except their personalities, it is supposed that the general good is naturally less interesting to women than to men. Mill challenges the stereotype that women are inherently uninterested in the greater good, particularly in politics. He argues that such assumptions are based on superficial observations without any understanding of the conditions under which women have been placed. Just as other groups have been misunderstood based on unfair stereotypes, women are wrongly judged based on their limited opportunities to engage in political and public life. Mill emphasizes that these misconceptions reflect a failure to consider the profound influence of social circumstances on behavior. Quote 21. The profoundest knowledge of the laws of the formation of character is indispensable to entitle anyone to affirm even that there is any difference, much more what the difference is, between the two sexes considered as moral and rational beings. Mill asserts that no one can justifiably claim to know the natural differences between men and women without an in-depth understanding of how character is formed. He argues that most of what people assume to be inherent differences between the sexes is, in fact, shaped by external factors such as upbringing and social conditioning. Only after thoroughly understanding and accounting for these influences can any true natural differences be identified. However, since this level of knowledge does not yet exist, any claims about the inherent nature of either sex are speculative at best. Quote 22. The fear of losing ground in his opinion or in his feelings is so strong that even in an upright character, there is an unconscious tendency to show only the best side, or the side which, though not the best, is that which he most likes to see. Mill describes the power dynamics that inhibit true understanding between individuals in unequal relationships, particularly between men and women. He points out that women often feel pressured to present themselves in a way that will be most pleasing to the men in their lives, rather than expressing their true selves. This desire to maintain favor leads to a lack of genuine openness and hinders men from fully understanding women. Mill emphasizes that real knowledge of another person's character can only exist between equals, where there is no fear of negative judgment or loss of affection. Quote 23. It is but of yesterday that women have either been qualified by literary accomplishments or permitted by society to tell anything to the general public. Mill highlights how recently women have gained the ability to express their thoughts publicly through writing. He points out that for most of history, women were not educated or encouraged to share their perspectives, and even now, they face significant societal pressures to conform to male expectations. As a result, much of what women write is influenced by a desire to gain favor rather than reflect their true opinions. Mill suggests that only when women are free to express themselves without fear of judgment will society gain a genuine understanding of their nature and capabilities. Quote 24. The general opinion of men is supposed to be that the natural vocation of a woman is that of a wife and mother. Mill questions the assumption that being a wife and mother is the natural role for all women. He argues that if this were truly the case, there would be no need to restrict women's opportunities or force them into these roles through social and legal pressures. The very fact that society closes other doors to women suggests a fear that, given the freedom to choose, many women would reject traditional roles unless marriage and motherhood were made more equitable and desirable. Mill implies that a truly natural vocation would not require coercion, and the need for such restrictions reveals a lack of confidence in the supposed naturalness of these roles. Quote 25. One thing we may be certain of, that what is contrary to women's nature to do, they never will be made to do by simply giving their nature free play. Mill argues that there is no need to impose restrictions on women to prevent them from doing things that are supposedly unnatural for them. If certain pursuits are genuinely against a woman's nature, then simply allowing her freedom will ensure that she naturally avoids them. Mill believes that competition and free choice will lead women to the activities for which they are best suited, without any need for artificial barriers. By removing these restrictions, society will be able to determine, through women's own choices, what they are capable of and interested in, rather than relying on preconceived notions and imposed limitations. Quote 26. Marriage being the destination appointed by society for women, the prospect they are brought up to, and the object which it is intended should be sought by all of them, except those who are too little attractive to be chosen by any man as his companion. Mill criticizes the way society conditions women to view marriage as their ultimate goal, with little regard for their other talents or aspirations. Women are raised to believe that marriage is their primary purpose, which limits their potential and reduces their value to merely being attractive enough to secure a partner. This societal expectation confines women to a single path, denying them the freedom to choose other ways to lead fulfilling lives and participate equally in society. Quote 27. She vows a lifelong obedience to him at the altar, and is held to it all through her life by law. Mill points out the deeply rooted legal obligation that binds a wife to obey her husband for her entire life. Unlike men, who are not bound by such a vow, women are legally subjected to their husband's authority, which effectively turns them into lifelong dependents. This state of affairs is not only unfair, but also reinforces the unequal power dynamics within marriage, depriving women of autonomy and the ability to make decisions about their own lives without male approval. Quote 28. The wife is the actual bondservant of her husband, no less so, as far as legal obligation goes, than slaves, commonly so called. Mill starkly compares the position of wives to that of slaves, emphasizing that in terms of legal obligations, wives have very few rights of their own. While they may not face the same physical hardships as slaves, their complete dependence on their husbands means that their freedom is severely restricted. Mill highlights that this unequal relationship persists under the guise of marriage, where women are expected to serve and obey without any corresponding rights or protections for themselves. Quote 29. The two are called one person in law, for the purpose of inferring that whatever is hers is his, but the parallel inference is never drawn that whatever is his is hers. Mill criticizes the hypocrisy inherent in the legal treatment of married couples, where the concept of being one person is used only to grant the husband control over the wife's property and rights. This legal fiction does not provide the wife with equal access to her husband's rights or possessions, revealing the biased nature of the law that benefits only the male partner. Mill exposes this double standard as another means of keeping women subordinate and dependent. Quote 30. If she leaves her husband, she can take nothing with her, neither her children nor anything which is rightfully her own. Mill describes the severe limitations faced by a wife who tries to leave her husband. She has no legal claim to her children or her own property, making it almost impossible for her to escape an abusive or unhappy marriage. This legal framework traps women in relationships where they may face mistreatment, as they have no viable means of supporting themselves or retaining custody of their children if they leave. Mill argues that this lack of legal protection makes marriage an oppressive institution for many women. Quote 31, "Laws and institutions require to be adapted, not to good men, but to bad." Mill argues that laws should be designed to protect individuals from the worst behavior, not simply assume that everyone will act benevolently. While there are undoubtedly many good husbands who treat their wives well, the law must also account for those who would abuse their power. By allowing husbands to have absolute authority over their wives, the law fails to protect women from potential abuse, as it places too much trust in the character of individual men rather than establishing safeguards against misuse of power. Quote 32. "It is not because a man is not known to have broken any of the 10 Commandments, or because he maintains a respectable character in his dealings with those whom he cannot compel to have intercourse with him, or because he does not fly out into violent bursts of ill temper against those who are not obliged to bear with him, that it is possible to surmise of what sort his conduct will be in the unrestraint of home." Mill emphasizes that a man's public demeanor does not necessarily reflect his behavior within the privacy of his home. He points out that many individuals reserve their worst qualities, such as selfishness, violence, and ill temper, for those who are powerless to oppose them, like their wives. The domestic environment, where a man holds considerable power, often brings out the worst aspects of his character. Mill highlights the discrepancy between how men behave in public, where their actions are restrained by social consequences, and how they act in private, when those restraints are removed. Quote 33. "We know that the bad propensities of human nature are only kept within bounds when they are allowed no scope for their indulgence." Mill asserts that human nature has a tendency toward selfishness and abuse of power when unchecked. He argues that the only way to ensure fair and just behavior is by limiting the opportunities for such tendencies to manifest. In the context of marriage, giving men unchecked power over their wives allows them to indulge their basest impulses without accountability. Mill contends that social institutions should aim to minimize opportunities for abuse, rather than assuming individuals will act virtuously when given excessive power. Quote 34. "The wife's power of being disagreeable generally only establishes a counter-tyranny, and makes victims in their turn chiefly of those husbands who are least inclined to be tyrants." Mill acknowledges that some wives use their ability to be unpleasant as a way to resist their husband's authority. However, he points out that this form of retaliation often targets those men who are least likely to be abusive, thereby creating a counter-tyranny that further distorts the relationship. This dynamic benefits neither party and only perpetuates a cycle of resentment and conflict. Mill argues that true equality, rather than informal power struggles, is needed to create a fair and balanced partnership between spouses. Quote 35. "Her power often gives her what she has no right to, but does not enable her to assert her own rights." Mill describes the paradox of power within marriage, where a wife might be able to influence her husband in ways that benefit her personally, but still lacks the legal means to claim her own basic rights. This informal influence may allow her to sway her husband's decisions on certain matters, but it does not provide her with true autonomy or the ability to stand up for herself on issues of fundamental importance. Mill suggests that rather than relying on manipulative tactics, women should be granted equal rights within marriage to ensure fairness and respect. Quote 36. "It is not true that in all voluntary association between two people, one of them must be absolute master, still less that the law must determine which of them it shall be." Mill challenges the notion that one partner must always dominate in a relationship. He argues that partnerships, whether in marriage or business, do not require one person to have absolute authority. Instead, decisions can be made jointly or responsibilities divided based on individual strengths. Mill suggests that the law should not automatically designate one partner as the superior. Instead, the nature of the partnership should be determined by mutual agreement. This approach would allow for a more equitable relationship, free from the imposition of unnecessary hierarchies. Quote 37. "The equality of married persons before the law is not only the sole mode in which that particular relation can fully realize its beneficent possibilities, but is the only means of rendering marriage consistent with justice. Mill argues that true equality under the law is essential for marriage to reach its full potential as a positive and fulfilling relationship. Without legal equality, one partner is placed in a position of subordination, which inevitably leads to injustice and limits the ability of both partners to fully contribute to and benefit from the marriage. Mill believes that only through legal equality can marriage become a just institution, where both individuals are respected as equals and are able to freely pursue their own happiness within the relationship. Quote 38. The only school of genuine moral sentiment is society between equals. Mill asserts that true moral development can only occur in relationships between equals. He argues that the existing moral education, which has largely emanated from hierarchical relationships built on power dynamics, is inadequate for fostering genuine moral growth. In the past, societies were structured on the basis of command and obedience, and moralities were developed to fit these unequal relations. However, Mill contends that as humanity progresses, equality should become the foundation of all relationships, including marriage, to ensure that society becomes a school for cultivating virtues like justice and empathy, rather than perpetuating despotism. Quote 39. The family, justly constituted, would be the real school of the virtues of freedom. Mill believes that a family where parents treat each other as equals would be an ideal environment for instilling the virtues of freedom and equality. In such a family, children would learn by example, witnessing love and cooperation without any power imbalance between the parents. This would help foster values like empathy, respect, and mutual understanding in the next generation. Mill emphasizes that while families are naturally a school of obedience for children and command for parents, the relationship between the parents should be one of equality to serve as a proper model for the children. Quote 40. Any sentiment of freedom which can exist in a man whose nearest and dearest intimacies are with those of whom he is absolute master is not the genuine or Christian love of freedom. Mill challenges the notion that men who hold absolute power over their wives can genuinely understand or love freedom. He argues that the kind of freedom such men value is often self-centered, rooted in a desire for personal autonomy while being comfortable with imposing authority over others. Mill suggests that this form of freedom is fundamentally flawed because it does not extend respect or autonomy to others, especially those closest to them. True love of freedom, according to Mill, must be consistent. It cannot exist alongside the subjugation of others. Quote 41. The less fit a man is for the possession of power, the less likely to be allowed to exercise it over any person with that person's voluntary consent, the more does he hug himself in the consciousness of the power the law gives him. Mill observes that those who are least qualified to wield power are often the ones who cling to it the most. In the context of marriage, this means that men who might otherwise lack the competence or character to lead often take comfort in the power that the law gives them over their wives. This sense of entitlement leads to the abuse of power, not because it is deserved, but simply because it is available. Mill suggests that this dynamic is particularly harmful in the lower classes, where men often view their wives as subjects for indignity, further perpetuating a cycle of oppression and disrespect. Quote 42. We are told that St. Paul said, "Wives, obey your husbands," but he also said, "Slaves, obey your masters." Mill addresses the argument that religion, particularly Christianity, mandates the subordination of wives to husbands. He points out that while St. Paul did indeed tell wives to obey their husbands, he also instructed slaves to obey their masters, reflecting the social norms of his time rather than a divine endorsement of those relationships. Mill argues that it was not St. Paul's role to incite rebellion against existing institutions, but to spread Christianity within the framework of the existing social order. Mill suggests that using religious texts to justify the oppression of women is misguided, as Christianity was not meant to perpetuate existing inequalities but to inspire progress and change. Quote 43. Whatever would be the husband's or wife's if they were not married should be under their exclusive control during marriage. Mill argues for equality and property rights within marriage, emphasizing that each partner should retain control over whatever property they would have had if they were not married. This principle would prevent the unjust situation where one spouse, typically the husband, has complete control over the other's assets. Mill supports the idea of community of goods, but only when it results from a genuine unity of feelings, rather than an imposed legal obligation that benefits one partner at the expense of the other. He believes that equal property rights are fundamental to ensuring fairness and independence within marriage, allowing both partners to retain their dignity and autonomy. Quote 44. Their disabilities elsewhere are only clung to in order to maintain their subordination in domestic life, because the generality of the male sex cannot yet tolerate the idea of living with an equal. Mill argues that the exclusion of women from public functions and occupations is largely motivated by men's desire to maintain their dominance in domestic life. He suggests that many men are uncomfortable with the idea of living on equal terms with women, and thus societal structures are designed to keep women in a subordinate position. If men could accept women as equals in the home, they would likely be more open to granting them equal opportunities in other areas, such as in the workplace or in politics. The resistance to women's broader participation in society, therefore, is rooted not in their abilities, but in the fear of losing male dominance. Quote 45. Women, and not a few merely, but many women, have proved themselves capable of everything, perhaps without a single exception, which is done by men, and of doing it successfully and creditably. Mill asserts that history has shown that women are capable of achieving success in all areas that men have traditionally dominated. He points out that many women have demonstrated their abilities in various fields, disproving the idea that they are inherently less capable than men. Mill argues that the fact that women have successfully undertaken roles traditionally reserved for men should be sufficient to grant them the opportunity to compete for those roles. Denying them this chance not only deprives them of their rights, but also prevents society from benefiting from their talents. Quote 46. To have a voice in choosing those by whom one is to be governed is a means of self-protection due to everyone, though he were to remain forever excluded from the function of governing. Mill emphasizes the importance of granting women the right to vote, even if they are not allowed to hold public office. He argues that voting is a fundamental means of self-protection that should be available to everyone, regardless of whether they are eligible to govern. Allowing women to participate in elections ensures that their interests are represented and provides them with a measure of protection against unjust governance. Mill also notes that women are already trusted to make significant decisions, such as choosing a husband, which underscores the inconsistency of denying them the right to vote in public matters. Quote 47. What they have done, that at least, if nothing else, it is proved that they can do. Mill argues that women should be judged based on their past achievements rather than speculative theories about their capabilities. He asserts that if women have already accomplished certain things, it is clear proof that they are capable of doing them. Mill criticizes the exclusion of women from political and public roles, pointing out that there is no legal barrier preventing a woman from excelling in fields like literature or art, but the law does prevent them from holding positions of political authority, despite historical evidence that women have excelled as rulers and leaders. This inconsistency demonstrates that the limitations placed on women are based on prejudice rather than their actual abilities. Quote 48. The ladies of reigning families are the only women who are allowed the same range of interests and freedom of development as men, and it is precisely in their case that there is not found to be any inferiority. Mill highlights that women of royal families, who are allowed the same freedom and access to education as men, have consistently demonstrated their capability in governance and other areas of public life. He argues that when women are given the same opportunities as men, they are not found to be inferior. The success of queens and princesses in ruling effectively, often during challenging times, shows that women's perceived limitations are a result of the restrictions placed on them rather than any inherent inability. Mill suggests that if all women were given the same opportunities for development, their abilities would match those of men. Quote 49. The general bent of their talents is towards the practical. Mill suggests that women's talents are often oriented towards practical matters, which is evident from both historical and everyday observations. He explains that the intuitive perception for which women are often credited involves rapid and accurate insight into present situations, which is a practical skill rather than a theoretical one. Women are more inclined towards understanding real, immediate issues rather than abstract principles. This talent for perceiving the immediate reality makes women particularly adept at practical decision-making, often surpassing men in their ability to grasp the nuances of situations directly in front of them. Quote 50. A woman usually sees much more than a man of what is immediately before her. Mill argues that women's ability to perceive details in the present moment is generally sharper than that of men. This quality, often described as intuition, gives women a particular advantage in dealing with practical situations. Unlike men, who are sometimes hindered by preconceived notions or theoretical constructs, women are more likely to see things as they are, without bias. This heightened perception is crucial for effective practical action, as it helps in accurately assessing the specific details and circumstances of a situation. Mill believes this skill is central to women's practical abilities and an asset in various aspects of life. Quote 51. Women are comparatively unlikely to fall into the common error of men, that of sticking to their rules in a case whose specialities either take it out of the class to which the rules are applicable or require a special adaptation of them. Mill explains that women tend to be more flexible than men when applying general rules to specific situations. Men often adhere rigidly to established rules, even when those rules may not fully fit a particular situation, whereas women are more likely to recognize when a unique circumstance requires deviation from the norm. This adaptability is particularly valuable in practical affairs, where rigid adherence to rules can lead to mistakes. Women's ability to quickly assess and adapt to the specific nuances of each situation makes them effective in managing real-life complexities that require a tailored approach rather than a one-size-fits-all solution. Quote 52. Strong feeling is the instrument and element of strong self-control, but it requires to be cultivated in that direction. Mill asserts that the presence of strong emotions which women are often thought to possess can actually serve as the foundation for strong self-control if properly cultivated. He argues that intense feelings can lead to greater dedication to duty and a stronger sense of justice, as long as those feelings are channeled effectively. Mill uses the example of passionate characters who become rigorously self-disciplined when their emotions are directed towards a sense of duty. He suggests that instead of viewing women's emotional intensity as a weakness, it should be seen as a potential strength that, with proper training, can be transformed into effective self-control and moral steadfastness. Quote 53. The capacity of passing promptly from one subject of consideration to another, without letting the active spring of the intellect run down between the two, is a power far more valuable, and this power women preeminently possess. Mill highlights women's ability to switch quickly and effectively between different tasks, a skill that is particularly useful in practical settings. Unlike men, who may prefer to focus intensely on a single task, women are adept at managing multiple concerns simultaneously, maintaining their mental agility without losing momentum. This ability is especially valuable in daily life, where individuals are often required to handle various responsibilities at once. Mill attributes this capacity partly to the nature of women's traditional roles, which involve managing numerous small tasks that demand constant mental engagement. He sees this mental mobility as a significant strength that enables women to adapt to changing demands efficiently. Quote 54. The business of a woman's ordinary life is things in general, and can as little cease to go on as the world to go round. Mill emphasizes that women are constantly engaged in managing a wide range of responsibilities, which require them to keep multiple concerns in mind at all times. Unlike specialized tasks that may have a beginning and an end, the responsibilities of women's lives are ongoing and diverse, much like the perpetual motion of the world. This continuous and all-encompassing nature of their duties demands adaptability and vigilance, as their roles often involve multitasking and attending to the needs of others without interruption. Quote 55. It is by no means established that the brain of a woman is smaller than that of a man. Mill challenges the argument that men have superior mental capacity simply because their brains are larger. He points out that there is no definitive evidence proving that women have smaller brains than men, and even if they did, brain size does not necessarily correlate with intelligence. Using this argument would lead to absurd conclusions, such as suggesting that a larger man is inherently more intelligent than a smaller one, or that an elephant's brain size makes it superior to humans. Mill dismisses the notion that brain size alone determines mental capacity, suggesting instead that the quality of the brain and its activity are more important factors. Quote 56. The efficiency of an organ is known to depend not solely on its size, but on its activity. Mill argues that the effectiveness of the brain is not determined only by its size, but also by its level of activity. He suggests that women may have an advantage in terms of cerebral circulation, leading to greater activity in the brain, which could explain their quicker response times and heightened sensitivity. While men might excel in tasks requiring prolonged focus due to potentially larger brain size, women may have a more active brain capable of rapid adaptation and responsiveness. Mill's argument highlights the importance of both the quality and activity of the brain in determining mental capabilities, rather than relying solely on size as a measure of intelligence. Quote 57. No production in philosophy, science, or art, entitled to the first rank, has been the work of a woman. Mill acknowledges that women have not yet produced groundbreaking works in fields such as philosophy, science, or art. However, he argues that this cannot be taken as evidence of women's inherent incapacity for such achievements. Women's exclusion from education and the opportunity to cultivate their talents for most of history means that they have not had the chance to reach their full potential. Mill suggests that women have not been able to participate in these fields long enough for a fair comparison to be made, and that, given time and equal opportunity, women could achieve the same levels of excellence as men. Quote 58. If women lived in a different country from men and had never read any of their writings, they would have had a literature of their own. Mill argues that women's literature has largely been shaped by the existing works of men, as women have been exposed to a male-dominated literary tradition. Just as Roman literature is often considered an imitation of Greek literature because the Greeks came first, women's literary works have similarly been influenced by the male tradition that preceded them. Mill believes that if women had been isolated from men's literary influence, they would have developed their own distinct literary tradition. This observation highlights the impact of historical context on women's creative expression, implying that women's originality has been stifled by the overwhelming presence of an already established male canon. Quote 59. All women who write are pupils of the great male writers. Mill argues that the influence of male writers on women's literature has been profound because women have always learned from men. Just as a painter initially mimics the style of their teacher, women's writing has been shaped by the models they had before them, which were primarily male. Mill suggests that it will take generations for women's individuality in literature to be fully developed, and for their voices to become distinct from those of their predecessors. The process of literary evolution is gradual, and until women have had enough time to grow independent from existing male influences, their works will continue to be guided by those established norms. Quote 60. Women artists are all amateurs. Mill highlights that in the fine arts, women's involvement is often limited to an amateur level, which is why they have not reached the heights of artistic achievement that men have. He notes that women are taught the arts as hobbies rather than professional pursuits, which limits their ability to achieve greatness. Unlike men, women are rarely given the opportunity to develop their skills to the level of a professional, and this disparity affects their achievements in fields like music and painting. Mill points out that the only art form in which women are treated more as professionals is acting, and in that domain, women have shown themselves to be equal to or even superior to men. Quote 61. The time and thoughts of every woman have to satisfy great previous demands on them for things practical. Mill emphasizes that the time women have for intellectual or artistic pursuits is severely constrained by their numerous practical responsibilities. Women are expected to manage households, family interactions, and social obligations, leaving little time for creative or scholarly endeavors. Even women of higher social standing who may not face the same household responsibilities are still burdened with social obligations and expectations regarding their appearance and demeanor. This constant engagement with practical duties prevents women from dedicating themselves to pursuits that require sustained focus and uninterrupted time, such as art or philosophy. Quote 62. Everything a woman does is done at odd times. Mill highlights the challenge women face in pursuing intellectual or artistic interests, as they must often fit these pursuits into spare moments amid their numerous responsibilities. Unlike men, who may have the luxury of dedicated time for their work, women are expected to be available to others and fulfill social and domestic duties at all times. This fragmented approach to intellectual work makes it difficult for women to achieve excellence in fields that require prolonged concentration and dedication. Mill argues that this situation severely limits women's ability to make significant contributions to art or scholarship, as their time and focus are constantly interrupted. Quote 63. Women seldom have this eagerness for fame. Mill points out that women generally do not have the same drive for fame that men do, which is partly why they have not pursued the highest levels of achievement in intellectual and artistic fields. He attributes this to societal conditioning rather than an inherent lack of ambition. Men are encouraged to strive for recognition and fame, which is seen as noble, while women are discouraged from seeking such public acclaim, as it is considered unfeminine. Instead, women are taught to focus on being admired by those around them, limiting their ambitions to the domestic sphere. Mill argues that this difference in aspiration is not natural, but is shaped by the roles that society imposes on women. Quote 64. Marriage is the only actual bondage known to our law. There remain no legal slaves, except the mistress of every house. Mill argues that the legal status of marriage subjects women to a form of servitude that is unique in modern law. Unlike other forms of social inequality that have been abolished, such as slavery, marriage continues to bind women in an unequal relationship where they are expected to submit to their husbands. Mill emphasizes that this legal power is given indiscriminately to all men, including those who are unworthy or abusive. This inequality is a contradiction to the principles of modern society, which supposedly values justice and equality. Mill calls for an end to this systemic injustice, highlighting that no one should have absolute authority over another human being based purely on gender. Quote 65. The vast amount of this gain to human nature, it is hardly possible by any explanation or illustration to place in a stronger light than it is placed by the bare statement, to anyone who attaches a moral meaning to words. Mill stresses the profound moral importance of replacing the unjust subordination of women with a relationship based on equality. He argues that regulating human relations by justice rather than injustice would have an immeasurable benefit for society. This shift would help eradicate selfishness, unjust self-preference, and the false sense of superiority that many men grow up believing they inherently possess over women. Mill suggests that this change is essential for the moral development of individuals and society as a whole, as it would eliminate the unearned privileges that corrupt the character of those who hold power over others without deserving it. Quote 66. the principle of the modern movement in morals and politics is that conduct, and conduct alone, entitles to respect. Mill emphasizes that the foundation of modern moral and political progress is the belief that respect should be earned through one's actions, not by birth or unearned privileges. He argues that society should be based on merit and justice rather than on the arbitrary power of the strong over the weak. Mill asserts that as long as the subordination of women remains a fundamental part of social institutions, efforts to instill justice and equality will continue to face resistance. By granting men authority over women based on gender alone, society undermines the principle that respect and authority should be based on merit, thus hindering true moral progress. Quote 67. The second benefit to be expected from giving to women the free use of their faculties would be that of doubling the mass of mental faculties available for the higher service of humanity. Mill argues that allowing women equal opportunities would significantly increase the intellectual resources available to society. By opening all fields of education and employment to women, society would effectively double the pool of talent that could be used for the advancement of humanity. Mill points out that there is a shortage of individuals capable of excelling in roles that require considerable ability, and by excluding women, society is wasting a vast amount of potential. He also notes that giving women the same opportunities as men would not only benefit society by increasing the number of capable individuals, but would also create healthy competition, which would drive both men and women to achieve greater excellence. Quote 68. The chivalrous ideal is the acme of the influence of women's sentiments on the moral cultivation of mankind. Mill describes how the concept of chivalry represents the peak of the influence that women's moral values have had on society. Chivalry attempted to combine the highest standards of bravery and martial prowess with virtues like gentleness, generosity, and respect towards those who were defenseless, particularly women. While the practice of chivalry often fell short of its ideal, it remains a significant milestone in moral history as an organized effort to elevate societal values beyond mere power and aggression. However, Mill also points out that the chivalrous ideal was suited to a society based on individual prowess, whereas modern society requires justice, equality, and respect for individual rights as its foundation. He argues that relying on chivalry is no longer sufficient, as modern society must ensure that the rights of all individuals are protected by law, rather than relying on the goodwill of those in power. Quote 69. At present, the moral influence of women is no less real, but it is no longer of so marked and definite a character. It has more nearly merged in the general influence of public opinion. Mill argues that while women's moral influence still exists, it has become more diffuse and less distinct. Historically, women have played a significant role in promoting ideals of spirit and generosity, often encouraging men to adhere to a chivalrous standard of behavior. However, their influence is now more closely integrated with public opinion, which has both positive and negative aspects. Women tend to encourage softer virtues like empathy and charity, but their focus on immediate effects rather than long-term consequences can lead to unintended harm, particularly in areas like philanthropy. Mill suggests that with a broader education and more exposure to the practical consequences of their actions, women could exercise a more informed and beneficial influence on society. Quote 70. Women's influence is often anything but favorable to public virtue. Mill argues that the influence of women on public virtue is limited by their upbringing and the narrow scope of their moral education. Women are often taught principles that are primarily negative, focusing on what should be avoided rather than on proactive moral duties. As a result, women may discourage actions that are in the public interest if they do not see the immediate benefit to themselves or their families. Mill suggests that women's influence is often more focused on maintaining stability and avoiding risks, which can hinder acts of disinterested public service or broader social contributions. He implies that a more comprehensive education for women would help them understand and support actions that benefit society as a whole. Quote 71. "Whoever has a wife and children has given hostages to Mrs. Grundy." Mill uses this phrase to highlight how societal expectations can restrict men's actions, particularly when their wives prioritize social acceptance over personal convictions. He argues that women, often having no direct stake in larger societal issues, may place more importance on maintaining social status and respectability, thus discouraging their husbands from taking stands that might jeopardize their family's position in society. This pressure to conform to societal norms acts as a restraint on men who might otherwise pursue actions or ideas that are unconventional but morally significant. Mill emphasizes that this dynamic not only limits individual freedom, but also suppresses progress by discouraging people from challenging the status quo. Quote 72. "Unlikeness may attract, but it is likeness which retains, and in proportion to the likeness is the suitability of the individuals to give each other a happy life." Mill argues that true companionship in marriage is based on similarity rather than difference. While initial attraction may arise from differences, lasting happiness comes from shared values, interests, and goals. The significant disparity in education and upbringing between men and women creates a fundamental divide that makes it difficult for them to truly understand and support each other. This lack of similarity often results in a lack of unity in daily life, leading to compromises that leave both partners unsatisfied. Mill suggests that if men and women were given equal opportunities for development, they would be more likely to find common ground, leading to a deeper and more enduring bond in marriage. Quote 73. "Any society which is not improving is deteriorating, and the more so, the closer and more familiar it is." Mill argues that close relationships, like marriage, have a significant impact on personal development. When one partner is intellectually or morally inferior to the other and does not actively seek to improve, the relationship can become stagnant and even detrimental to the more capable partner. In such cases, the superior partner may begin to regress due to a lack of stimulation and challenge. Mill emphasizes that a healthy and beneficial relationship requires both partners to be actively striving for growth, thereby encouraging and uplifting each other. Without this mutual development, the relationship risks becoming a hindrance to both individuals' personal progress. Quote 74. "An unimproving and unstimulating companionship is substituted for the society of his equals in powers and his fellows in the higher pursuits." Mill argues that many men, after marrying, find themselves in a situation where they no longer seek intellectual stimulation from the company of their equals. Instead, their primary companion is their wife, who, despite having some education, is often intellectually inferior due to societal restrictions on women's learning. This lack of intellectual stimulation leads men to stagnate and even regress in their personal development. Mill highlights that the companionship offered by a partner who cannot challenge or push one intellectually leads to a comfortable but uninspiring existence, ultimately contributing to the decline of a man's aspirations and growth. Quote 75. "What marriage may be in the case of two persons of cultivated faculties, identical in opinions and purposes, each can enjoy the luxury of looking up to the other." Mill envisions an ideal marriage where both partners are intellectually equal and share similar values and aspirations. In such a relationship, each partner can both lead and be led, fostering mutual growth and a deeper bond. This kind of marriage allows both individuals to feel enriched by the relationship, as they continually learn from and inspire each other. Mill believes that this is the true ideal of marriage, and that any customs or institutions that prevent such equality are remnants of a primitive and unjust society. He argues that true moral progress can only begin when marriage is based on equal justice and mutual respect. Quote 76. "After the primary necessities of food and raiment, freedom is the first and strongest want of human nature." Mill emphasizes that, beyond basic needs, the desire for freedom is fundamental to human happiness. He argues that as individuals become more aware of their responsibilities and the value of reason, they do not lose their desire for freedom, but instead seek to exercise it within the bounds of duty and rationality. This desire for personal freedom is just as strong in women as it is in men, yet women have historically been denied the ability to direct their own lives. Mill insists that the lack of freedom is not only a source of unhappiness, but also a barrier to the full development of human potential. And he calls for the liberation of women so that they too can experience the dignity and fulfillment that come from living freely. Quote 77. An active and energetic mind, if denied liberty, will seek for power. Refused the command of itself, it will assert its personality by attempting to control others. Mill argues that when individuals are denied the freedom to direct their own lives, they often compensate by seeking control over others. This is particularly true for women, who, deprived of personal autonomy, may channel their energies into trying to influence or dominate those around them. Mill suggests that this dynamic contributes to behaviors like excessive concern with personal beauty or social standing, as women seek power in whatever form is available to them. He points out that the desire for power arises when the more natural and healthy desire for personal liberty is thwarted. Only by granting women the same freedoms enjoyed by men can society diminish the negative effects of this frustrated desire for power. Quote 78. There is nothing, after disease, indigence, and guilt, so fatal to the pleasurable enjoyment of life as the want of a worthy outlet for the active faculties. Mill emphasizes the importance of having a meaningful purpose in life as a key component of happiness. He points out that many women, especially those who have raised families and find themselves without further responsibilities, suffer from a lack of purpose. This lack of opportunity to use their abilities in a meaningful way leads to feelings of emptiness and dissatisfaction. Mill argues that society's refusal to allow women to engage in pursuits beyond the domestic sphere deprives them of the chance to find fulfillment through their talents and ambitions. He calls for the removal of barriers that restrict women's opportunities, asserting that allowing them to participate fully in society would not only benefit women, but also enrich humanity as a whole. The Subjection of Women, by John Stuart Mill, concludes by reaffirming that the full emancipation of women is essential not only for their well-being, but also for the advancement of society as a whole. Mill argues that true justice and moral progress can only be achieved when all individuals, regardless of gender, are treated as equals and given the opportunity to reach their potential. He envisions a society where relationships are based on equality, mutual respect, and shared interests, rather than on power and subordination. The book leaves a lasting impression of the necessity for reform, urging society to abandon outdated customs that limit women's freedom and to recognize the value of their contributions in all spheres of life.
Curious to dive into the mind of John Stuart Mill? With StudyLab Pro's book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of the subjection of women in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.